Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and this is the first in a series of videos where we're going to be making a full stack application using Node Express. So if you've never worked with Node before, you're going to want to download Node, so you can go to nodejs.org and download one of these two. And then you're also going to want to download my Express Boilerplate, which will be in the video description. Basically, this whole tutorial will be based around the boilerplate and how to use the boilerplate to create whatever application you want. So do that. So what we're going to do in this video is I'm going to walk you through the setup of the boilerplate so you know what you got in there. So what this does, it packages a lot of the stuff you would need to make an Express project in one folder, so that way life's a lot easier. So you'll get, when you unpackage the package, you'll have this folder, Express Boilerplate. Now in the root part of the folder, you have your proc file. This is for deploying to Heroku. You can leave it pretty much the way it is. Don't need to touch that. Package.json. This lists all your dependencies. So these are all the dependencies I already have installed in this boilerplate. Pretty much everything you would need to make pretty much most possible applications. So that's there. You may want to change some of these other variables, like who the author is. So you would want to edit that and the name of the app. But aside from that, everything else can pretty much be left untouched. But basically, that's what your package.json file does. There's your index.js file. This is sort of the heart of the application. We'll come back to this, okay, because this is a whole journey in itself. App.json, this is for Heroku. So this is going to be the information for Heroku on what your application is. So you may want to just change the variables in there to match your application. There's a .ignore file that you can leave alone. It just basically means what kind of things will Git ignore when you push the Git. Your .env file. Here's where you're going to put your environmental variables. Okay, so I do have .env installed, which will allow you to use environment variables. So that means anything you put in here, you'll be able to use locally. At the end of this video series, we'll kind of get to Heroku and you'll see how to set up your environment variables on Heroku. But for now, let's say you want to put your database name. You can just put a variable db name and then put, whatever the variable is going to be. And you'll be able to call it in your program by saying like process.env dot the name of the variable. So if I wanted to call this variable 2 times 2, I would just put in like process.env. So basically what I would put in the code, the variable would look like this, process.env.times, because it is case sensitive. Okay, if I wanted to use that variable in my code. The benefit of this is you can hide information like sensitive information, security related information, and then what you'll do is you'll set up those variables again when we go to production. But just, that's an important file. This is the only time I'm going to be looking at it during this video description, during this project. Because I don't want you seeing my secret information, but just so you know, that's where you put it so you can do it for your version. Now here are the folders that are set up. Basically, you have your views folder. This is where we're basically going to be setting up the visuals of the website. So when you hear the term model views controllers, basically the way it works is you have your models, which is going to basically be sort of our database, our interface with our database, which will be using Mongo for this project. So I do have Mongoose installed, and here are some templates for schemas in Mongoose. So one that's already made for users, which is pretty much usable right out of the box. And then here's just like a template you can duplicate and make for any other additional models you would want to create for your project. We'll go over that later on. Okay, then you have your controllers, which here we have a template for a controller, which you can just duplicate and edit to create whatever controllers you need, which are basically your routes. That's basic. So think about it this way: a user is going to send your website a request by going to a URL. Your controller is going to say, "Hey, you know what? This is going to control what happens when the user tries to access that route." So based on these routes, we're going to say, "Hey, we want to pull certain information from our model, take that information, send it over to our views, which are going to be the website." And say, hey, we're going to mush the information here and the views together, our template, and create a website that the user can see. Okay, and we're going to be using EJS, which is one of many Node.js templating engines. Okay, and then I already have pretty much a lot of a boilerplate set up here. So I have a boilerplate file, which you can just duplicate to create more pages. And then what I did here is I have a lot of partials. This makes it easier so you don't have to be like rewriting everything every time. So basically the head for each, so the header, and the footer all have different partials, which are in this folder. So if you want every page to have the same head, which is important because you want them to all have the same like title of the website. You want them to kind of use the same CSS framework if you're going to use that. And then here, if you go look at this head partial, okay, you'll see that I have commented all the main CSS frameworks. So if you want to make use of any of these frameworks, you can just basically comment it out, and we'll make use of it. Okay, on top of that, jQuery is in there if you decide you want to use jQuery. And let's see what else I got in here. Axios is in there, so for making API calls. And Font Awesome is in there, so you can do font icons. Okay, and then also a JavaScript file, which is linked to, and basically your own CSS and JavaScript file, both of them named EJS. So if you look in the public folder, which we'll talk about the public folder, it's a static folder. It's basically everything's relative to the root in there. So theoretically, if we don't, depending on if we had set up no routes, it would assume that this index.html here in the public folder is your root. So when you go to your URL, it just would open up that index.html file. We will not be using it for this project, but it's there. But for your templates, it's this ejs.js file that we would put any locally created JavaScript, and it's in this CSS here that you would create any locally created CSS. Okie dokie. So that's that. Let's see here. But again, so you have the boilerplate. So literally, again, this part are created in the partial. So all you have to do is just edit this stuff here, and it'll be consistent for all your pages. Okay. What's that doing there? Let's see here. Oh, that's right. Okay. Then we have a login page. Okay, that pretty much already has a boilerplate for to go for like a login field. Okay, this we won't need. This is an extra page. And then this is just a boilerplate for a page for creating a new user. Okay. With the form for creating a new user. We'll come back to all of these things later on. Cool. Now let's just quickly take a look at this index.js file, because we're going to be doing most of our work. Here's where I'm kind of including all the stuff you need to work with Express. So again, I've already basically out of the box, it should already have all your dependencies that you see here. Where are they? They're in this node modules folder. If for some reason you misplace your node modules folder, you can just always type in the command npm install, and it'll install. That's the great thing about package.json file, because basically if ever node modules are giving you a problem, just delete it. Just delete this folder, and if you type in npm install in your command line, it'll just reinstall all these dependencies, and you won't have to worry about it. So generally this, you'll just leave completely alone. Okay, but do change this. Do change this. Okay. Cool. And then here you just have some scripts that you can run. Okay. And the way you use these, clicked on package lock, so give me a second, it's going to load up. Yep. But if you wanted to use these scripts in your command line, you just type in npm run in the script. So it'd be like npm run dev, npm run start. For development, you're going to want run dev, or you could just type in nodamon index.js. And what that does, it's going to run a server, but it's going to run a server that updates every time you save to your project. So this way, as you make changes, those changes are automatically visible. Okay, back to the index.js. So let's walk through this line by line. This first line brings in Express into the program. So it's just saying, hey, because in Node, we have to do is you have to require your packages. Basically, you're taking, hey, we have this package, this dependency Express. We need to put it into a new variable. So this Express variable is going to equal our instance of Express. Now, from our Express object, we're going to also just Basically what we're doing is we're going to run this express function that's part of the express object and store it in app. Cool. And that's going to be our app object that you'll see used throughout. We're also going to want an instance of the router. So const router. So see, it says express.router. This is just boilerplate code you always have to do when you're doing these express projects. This is the port. So when you actually run the program, what port is it going to run in so you can see it on your local machine? It's either going to pull from an environment variable called port, which again in our .env file, I don't have a port variable defined. So in that case, it's going to use 5000 instead. So it's port. And the reason why you need this is because on Heroku, this is how it's going to work for Heroku. So you need that there. Method override. We'll discuss method override once we kind of need it later on. But for now, it's just know that's method override, which is going to help us be able to do put and delete requests with forms. This is bringing in .env, so that way you can use your environmental variables. Now, in order to interact with a Mongo, which is going to be the kind of database, it's a NoSQL database, so it's not relational. Basically, it's a database where it just keeps a bunch of JavaScript objects as a database. It's pretty cool. But we're going to be interacting with that by using Mongoose. Okay, so I'm bringing in Mongoose so we can use Mongoose, which allows us to connect to the database, which we need to create like a connection to the database, and that's what this is. We're saying, hey, DB equals our database connection. Now, this is not the actual connection. It's an object that will allow us to connect to the database, as you'll see in the code in a second. And then here are some variables to define where your database is. Okay, so later on we'll talk about Mongo more in detail on how to set up your URL for your database. If you just install Mongo on your local computer, this will work. Although I'll show you how to have a Mongo database not on your computer. Which in that case, you're going to want to set up a URL that's going to be in your environmental variables. Okay. This just leave alone. This is just something you need to avoid getting a bunch of random warnings from using Mongoose. So it's there, it works, it does what it's supposed to do. Moment is a library for working with dates. I'm probably not going to be referring or using Moment throughout this tutorial, but it will help you to work with dates in your JavaScript, in your application. So I would highly recommend looking up Moment and reading its documentation. Bcrypt is going to be used for encrypting passwords, so that way people can't hack into your database and find out all your users' passwords. And express session, so that way we can keep track of who's logged in. So basically with session, what it does, it basically creates it puts a cookie on the person's computer that keeps track of that they're logged in, either until like the server restarts or until they close their browser. So that way they don't have to keep logging in over and over again. Cool, so those are all our dependencies being brought in for the most part at the top. So for the most part, you don't need to touch this. Okay. Now this is just boilerplate for bringing in a controller. So right now this won't work. So if we run the code right now, it's going to error because this is not really referring to anything. We'll come back to that when we create our controllers. This piece of the code is where we actually connect to the database. So we're going to modify this a little bit, but essentially this is just saying, hey, this Mongo URI is the URL of the database you're connecting to, which is created by these two variables, which are defined up here. We'll come back to that later on. And then what this does, it says, hey, connect to this database, Mongo URI, and then pass in these variables, which is the DB update object, which is defined over here, which is going to, again, make sure those warnings don't show up. This is just code that actually executes the connection. So this says, hey, connect, and then this will run, this just monitors the connection and runs certain messages on your console while the connection's running. So that way you can tell if the connection is running or if you got disconnected. So that information is there. This section here was where you can put like runtime data. If you had like variables you wanted to have in this part of the application, probably you won't need anything. But it's there. The section's there, so that way it's easily all parsed out. This is your middleware. So essentially the way to think about it is when someone tries to send information to your Express server, really what's going to happen is that Express is going to take that request and then run through your middleware, which is basically the reason why it's called middleware is because it's what happens in the middle of a request and a response. So I send the request to your server, and then you're going to send me a response, but in between those two things happening, there's middleware. So here, the order we have it is first we have app.use express URL encoded. This is just there to, in case we're submitting a form data, so that way the form data is usable. Okay, then we have a method override. So in case maybe, hey, forms can really only make post requests. But what if I want a form to make a put request or a delete request? So this method override will monitor to see if we overrode the default post request on a form. Okay, and then here we have our controller. Okay, and again, this is just a boilerplate one, which won't do anything right now because we don't have a real controller set up. But essentially, if it picked up that someone was using a route that started off with /index, so it'd be like, you know, blah blah blah.com/index, it's going to send it to that controller, which will tell it what to do. Okay, and this will actually probably take out because we're not going to be setting up an API for this exercise, so we'll take that out later on. Okay, so this is the piece of the code that's actually going to get the server running. So this basically says, hey, start the server. You're going to listen on the port, which is in the variable that's defined up here, port, which again we said was like 5,000, or in your environmental variables. And when that starts, it's going to say, hello, I'm listening on port, whatever. Okay, so you may want to change that so it doesn't sound like it's greeting me. And these are just some boilerplate routes, which we probably may or may not use. We'll decide. Okay, and the very last line here is just another piece of middleware, which I should probably put back up with the middleware up there. What this does, it says, hey, if none of the controllers found any routes, if all the other middleware pieces that were first, if none of them got you where you needed to go, then what you're gonna do is you're gonna check this folder called public and see if there's a file in there that would satisfy the request. So if I were to type in, you know, blah blah blah.com/index.html and none of these routes really worked, it would then go take a look inside my public folder and say, hey, there's an index.html here, I'm gonna run that file. Okay, so basically saying, hey, if all else fails, go look in the public folder for something that should satisfy the request. Okay, and that's what you just called your static folder. Okay, so that's essentially the setup of this file. I'm going to leave it at that for this first video. In the next video, we'll actually start building out the application now that we've introduced the boilerplate that you can download in the video description. Have a great day and enjoy.